So what happens if Darren Till fights Carl Froch? What if Darren Till, fresh off showcasing his boxing skills in Misfits, stepped into the ring with Carl Froch, the battle-tested super middleweight legend? Now, Till's unorthodox power punches against Froch's granite chin and relentless pressure would ignite potentially pure chaos. And could Misfits Till shock the Cobra? Or would Froch's championship pedigree dominate? This is a fantasy showdown blurring the line between spectacle and legacy. So who would win? So obviously recently Darren Till was on Misfits, and there's an argument whether Misfits is good for boxing or it's bad for boxing. Then that fight, he had a sensational knockout. There's no doubt about that. And he called out Carl Froch. So I thought the best way to explore this is to look at their resumes. Now, when we look at Carl Froch, you would consider a great champion, a legend, a British legend. So let's look at some of his fights. So one of my favorite Carl Froch fights was against Jean Pascal. It was a 12-round war, and Pascal really brung the pain that night. And it was competitive, but Carl Froch just had that little bit more seasoning, that little bit more experience, and he won a grueling 12-round decision, and that gave him the WBC title. So that was a significant fight. And then we had the rematch with Kessler. And if people remember, Kessler had a really great battle with Joe Calzaghe, And in the initially Kessler beat Carl Froch. But then in the rematch, Carl Froch was able to overcome adversity and was able to win the rematch. I can't remember if it was a majority or unanimous decision, but what I can remember is that Miguel Kessler, I think he lost the first 3 rounds, but then in the middle of the fight, in the middle rounds, in the 5th and the 6th, he picked up momentum, but then Carl Froch took over in the later part of the fight. And again, this was another, this fight symbolized a few things: that Carl Froch had a great jab, he had great heart, and was able to overcome adversity. And then we had the Lucien Boutte fight. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Lucien Boutte was being touted at the time as the next great super middleweight champion. He was champion, and people were touting him as the best in the division. Carl Froch was a big underdog, and Lucien Boutte was fast. He had that flexibility. He had a strong jab. He was a southpaw, so he jabbed from the right hand, and a lot of people were seeing him as the future. And spectacularly, Carl Froch went in there, and as they would say, he took the bull by the horns, and he absolutely destroyed Lucien Boutte. It was an impeccable performance. I believe it was a 5th round stoppage. He respectively obliterated him, and that was, I think, a fight that really cemented his career. And then, of course, we had the George Groves rematch. And in the first fight, George Groves scored a knockdown in round 1. Great knockdown, dominated for 6 rounds. But Carl Froch came back, showed character, showed courage, and got a controversial stoppage, I believe, in round 9. In the rematch, George Groves played some significant mind games that seemed to be very effective. But then in the first fight, George Groves used significant mind games that seemed to get under Carl Froch's skin. But I remember in the second fight, Carl Froch, I think, employed a sports psychologist, and this time it felt that Carl Froch was winning the mind games. And in the fight, it was a competitive fight. But in round 8, I believe it was a feint, short left hook, and straight right. And that was the end of the fight. It was a tremendous knockout. And as Carl Froch will remind everyone, it was done in front of 80,000 people at Wembley. But all jokes aside, it was another great night. And the good thing about Carl Froch's career is that he's had a lot of dancing partners. And I've always said great fighters have great dancing partners. Muhammad Ali is a good example. You had the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier trilogy. 3 great fights. Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman. He's got these great dancing partners that define his career. And Carl Froch had multiple dancing partners that defined his career. And he's had even other great fights. You know, the author Abraham was at the time known as a formidable power puncher. And Carl Froch just dominated him behind the jab. And dominated him behind the jab and used a lot of combination punches and completely dominated the fight. Carl Froch had, he had those significant dancing partners, even if they weren't competitive fights. Lucien Boutet, it wasn't a competitive fight, but because of Lucien Boutet's reputation, he was able to, his reputation made it an event where you thought, oh, Carl Froch is probably not going to win this one. And he went in there and obliterated him. So he had different types of, dance partners. And of course, he had the loss to Andre Ward, who, is one of the greats. And he went 12 rounds with Andre Ward. So let's simply say Carl Froch's CV is of an elite standard. So that's Carl Froch's CV. But what about Darren Till? So Darren Till has a Muay Thai and kickboxing background. He was in the UFC, and to my understanding, he was a respectable title challenger. That needs to be respected. He's fought at the high level of UFC, and he had notable wins against Stephen Thompson and Kelvin Gastelum. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And he fought for the title against Tyrone Woodley. So he had, in the UFC, he was a world title contender. Now he's gone on into the misfits, and he has, you got to remember, misfits fights, to my knowledge, are not considered professional fights. I might be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. So he's had 3 misfits boxing matches. The first one was against Anthony Taylor, who respectively he destroyed. And Anthony Taylor is a good fighter. At that point, he had been busy. He had another good victory against Darren Stewart, who I believe had a UFC background. And then his last fight was against Luke Rockhold, and that was a sensational performance. So Darren Till has a different type of CV compared to Carl Froch. However, here's the disparity. Carl Froch, I believe, is 50 years old, and I think Darren Till is in his late 30s, and he's gaining some momentum. And also Darren Till is a southpaw, which adds an interesting element to the fight. Of course, if we had the Carl Froch of 10 years ago, this is not a fight. This is definitely not even a fight worth mentioning. But a 50-year-old Carl Froch, what does he have left? We know he wouldn't be able to fight at the world level, but in boxing there's different levels. There's British level, there's European level, there's world title challenger, there's world title level. There's different levels to this game. And we know that in his peak, he was a championship level fighter that could fight with the elite. He could hang with the best of them. We don't know what Darren Till's level is because it's hard to gauge what level his opposition is. So we can't ascertain if he's British level, European level, title challenger level, championship level. We can kind of take away the championship level and world title contender level. We can take away those levels, but where does he stand in the British level, European level? It's hard to ascertain on those performances where he stands. However, we shouldn't take away that his performances were electric, and it appears that he's in a very good boxing environment. So we got Darren Till on the ascendancy, and then we got Carl Froch, obviously in decline because he's older. But if this is one thing we can say, is that even though Carl Froch is clearly wouldn't be in fighting shape, why would he? Because he's not preparing for a fight. If you look at Carl Froch, you can see that he's clearly in good shape. He's maintained his fitness. But there's a difference between being in good shape and in fighting shape. So the question would be, could Carl Froch get into fighting shape? And could he even get to 60% of what he was? Because if he can, then if he maintains any of the punch resistance that he had, if he's retained that power and he has a proper camp, if he's at 60, 70%, then Carl Froch would win this fight. There's another important variable here as well. Darren Till is a southpaw. And the question would be, how does Carl Froch do against southpaws? And the reference point is Lucien Boutet. Lucien Boutet was a world champion and touted to be the next best thing. And Carl Froch absolutely destroyed him. So based on that premise, the variable of the southpaw seems to go in Carl Froch's favor. So I guess what I'm saying is that in the heyday of his career, this wouldn't even be a matchup. But with Carl Froch's age and with Darren Till's momentum, then this can be interesting. Also, let's give Darren Till credit. He's very good at marketing fights. In the Tommy Fury press conference, because they didn't eventually have a fight, he promoted himself very well by acting very chaotic. And he's been doing a good job of promoting himself through the platform of Misfits. So this is interesting, and I'm not sure if Carl Froch really has a desire to fight Darren Till. It looks like he's financially comfortable. He's made a lot of money from his fighting career. He's got a very good YouTube channel. He definitely understands the YouTube game. But who knows, if Darren Till can keep building his momentum and keep building with regards to his media presentation, and if the money's on the table, then who knows?